Intertwined Destinies, Kinship, Race, and Identity between the Haliwa-Saponi and African Americans of the Roanoke River Valley. Executive Summary. The relationship between the Haliwa-Saponi Indian tribe of North Carolina and the African American people of the same Halifax and Warren County region is one of profound historical complexity, rooted in shared genealogical origins and shaped by centuries of social and political pressures. This report finds that the two communities are inextricably linked through deep ancestral ties forged in the colonial crucible of the 17th and 18th centuries, a period that saw the coalescence of remnant indigenous tribes and the rise of a significant free black population in the Roanoke River Valley. This intermingling created a large, multi-ethnic kinship network in the area known as the Meadows, which serves as a common ancestral pool for many Haliwa-Saponi and African American families today. However, this shared heritage was fractured by the imposition of the rigid black/white racial binary of the Jim Crow South. Faced with a legal and social system that systematically erased non-binary identities by classifying all non-whites as colored, the ancestors of the modern Haliwa-Saponi undertook a deliberate and strategic process of ethnogenesis in the mid-20th century. This movement involved making conscious racial choices to assert a distinct Indian identity, a political act of survival necessary to avoid being absorbed into the legally disadvantaged colored category. Key to this process was the establishment of separate tribal institutions, the pursuit of state recognition, and the political necessity of distancing the community from its African American ancestry to meet the racialized criteria for Indian status. This report analyzes this history in three parts. Part 1 explores the colonial aorc formation of a multi-ethnic community in the Meadows. Part 2 examines the impact of the Jim Crow racial hierarchy and the Haliwa-Saponi's strategic assertion of a separate Indian identity. Part 3 assesses the contemporary legacy of this history, including the challenges it poses for federal recognition and the ongoing discourse surrounding ancestry and identity. The central conclusion is that the Haliwa-Saponi and their black neighbors are related by kinship, but separated by the divergent political histories their ancestors navigated. Their story is a powerful testament to the resilience of a people who, faced with erasure, chose to define themselves on their own terms, a choice that continues to shape their identity and their relationship with the surrounding community. Part 1. The Colonial Crucible, Forging a Multi-Ethnic Frontier. The modern relationship between the Haliwa-Saponi and African American communities of the North Carolina-Virginia borderlands cannot be understood without first examining the unique historical crucible of the colonial era. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the Roanoke River Valley became a dynamic and often volatile frontier where the remnants of once powerful indigenous nations, a growing population of enslaved and free Africans, and European settlers converged. This period was not characterized by rigid separation, but by a fluid process of displacement, coalescence, and intermixture that laid the genealogical foundation for the multi-ethnic communities that persist today. The very conditions of colonial expansion, warfare, and the plantation economy created a space where shared social status and geographic proximity fostered the creation of a common ancestral pool. 1.1. The Fate of the Piedmont Siouans. The primary indigenous ancestors of the Haliwa-Saponi are the Siouan-speaking peoples, who historically dominated the Piedmont region of what is now Virginia and North Carolina. Before European contact, tribes such as the Saponi, Tutelo, and Akinichi were populous and politically significant entities. In 1600, the Saponi population alone was estimated at 2,700 people. Early European explorers like John Lederer in 1670 described the Saponi as a warlike and rich nation governed by an absolute monarch inhabiting villages along the Staunton River, a tributary of the Roanoke. However, the arrival of Europeans and the intensification of colonial trade routes precipitated a rapid and catastrophic decline. The Saponi and their allies were caught between expanding English settlements to the east and increasing pressure from the powerful Haudenosaunee Iroquois Confederacy to the north, who waged devastating campaigns during the Beaver Wars to control the fur trade, compounded by repeated and deadly outbreaks of European infectious diseases to which they had no immunity. The Siouan populations were decimated. In response to these existential threats, the remnant populations adopted a strategy of consolidation for mutual protection. By the early 18th century, the remnants of the Saponi, Tutelo, Akanechi, Kiowawi, Innu, and Shakori had formally coalesced, becoming known collectively as the Saponi Nation. This confederation was a direct survival mechanism. Their numbers had dwindled so severely that by 1714 the entire Saponi Nation was enumerated at just over 300 people. Seeking stability and protection, this confederation entered into a treaty with Virginia's governor Alexander Spotswood in 1714, agreeing to settle at Fort Christiana, a reservation established near modern-day Brunswick County, Virginia. This fort served as a trading post and a buffer between English settlements and other tribes, and it became a critical site of interaction and further consolidation. The Virginia Council even encouraged the Nansemond, an Algonquian-speaking tribe, to merge with the Saponi at the fort to bolster their numbers. The Fort Christiana period was temporary. After the fort was officially abandoned by the Virginia colony in 1718, the consolidated Saponi Nation began to disperse. A significant portion migrated north over the next several decades, eventually settling in Pennsylvania and New York, where in 1753 they were formally adopted by the Cayuga Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. However, not all of the Saponi and their allies left the region. Historical records indicate that bands of Saponi remained in the borderlands of Granville, Halifax, and Warren County. These families, along with remnants of the Tuscarora and Nansemond, who also remained in the area, formed the nucleus of a persistent indigenous community in the territory that became known locally as the Meadows. 1.2. The rise of a free black population in the Roanoke River Valley, contemporaneous with the displacement and coalescence of the Piedmont Siouans, a distinct and historically significant African American community, was taking shape. In the same geographic area, while Halifax County was part of North Carolina's tobacco-driven plantation economy and had a large population of enslaved people, it was also distinguished by another demographic feature. It was home to one of the largest and longest established antebellum free people of color populations in the state. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, Halifax County had 2,452 free black residents, the highest number of any county in North Carolina. In some parts of the county, free people of color constituted as much as 1/4 of the total non-white population. The origins of this substantial FPOC community are crucial to understanding its relationship with the area's indigenous people. The groundbreaking genealogical research of Paul Heineck demonstrates that the majority of these families did not descend from white slave owners manumitting their mixed-race children, a common assumption. Instead, most free African American families who originated in colonial Virginia and North Carolina descended from unions between white servant women and African men, both enslaved and free, during the 17th and early 18th centuries. Under the legal doctrine of partis sequitur ventrem, the status of the child followed that of the mother. Therefore, the children of these unions were born free, and free. This historical reality created a class of people who were freeborn for generations before the American Revolution and the Civil War, establishing deep roots in the region as landowners and community members. Furthermore, this big population was not exclusively of African and European descent. Historical accounts from the period note that remnants of local indigenous groups such as the Cherokee and Tuscarora also mingled with the black and poor white communities, contributing to the ancestral makeup of the free people of color in the region. This created a population that was already multi-ethnic in character. The existence of this large, long-standing and landed FPOC community created a unique social landscape in the Roanoke River Valley. Unlike in many other parts of the Deep South, where society was starkly divided between a white landowning class and an enslaved black labor force, this region possessed a distinct social middle ground. The people in this space, both the remnant non-reservation Indians and the free people of color, occupied a similar and precarious legal and social position. They were neither white and entitled to the full rights of citizenship, nor were they enslaved and considered chattel property. In a society increasingly defined by a rigid white/black master/slave dichotomy, these two non-enslaved, non-white groups were pushed together by the dominant social and legal structures. They would have naturally found common ground for trade, cohabitation, and ultimately kinship as they navigated a world that had no formal place for them. This shared social space was the critical nexus where the indigenous and African American worlds of the Roanoke River Valley converged. 1.3 Confluence and Kinship in the Meadows. Evidence of a shared ancestral pool, the convergence of the displaced but persistent indigenous community and the established free African American population in the meadows of Halifax and Warren counties resulted in a significant degree of intermixture and the formation of a common ancestral pool. The historical and genealogical evidence for this confluence is substantial. Historical sources explicitly note that during the tumultuous 18th century, as tribal structures weakened, the remaining Saponi intermarried with both European colonists and free people of color. This was a practical survival strategy for a population with dwindling numbers. The most compelling evidence lies in the genealogical records of the region. A review of Haliwa-Saponi tribal history and modern enrollment reveals a core group of prominent family surnames, including Richardson, Lynch, Hedgepeth, Silver, Evans, and Mills. Simultaneously, historical records of the free people of color community in Halifax, Warren, and adjacent counties in North Carolina and Virginia show the prevalence of the very same surnames. For example, Dudley Lynch, an important figure in the Haliwa-Saponi community, and Julia Chavez, who married into the prominent Bibby family, are documented individuals with roots in this multi-ethnic milieu. The work of Haliwa-Saponi historian Marvin Richardson acknowledges this deep history of intermingling, stating plainly that Indians, blacks, and whites have intermingled and mixed for hundreds of years in the Meadows community. This pattern of a geographically concentrated community with mixed ancestry and a limited pool of surnames is characteristic of what social scientists have termed triracial isolates. Over 200 such communities have been identified in the eastern United States, groups known by various names like the Lumbee in North Carolina, the Melungeons in Tennessee, and the Westwarts in Maryland. These groups typically formed on the frontier or in isolated rural enclaves where interactions between remnant Native Americans, free African Americans, and European settlers were common. The community in the meadows fits this pattern precisely. The recurrence of shared surnames is not merely coincidental. It serves as a clear genealogical marker of a single, large, and largely endogamous kinship network that existed long before the modern racial and tribal classifications of the 20th century were imposed upon it. The people of this network were united by geography, shared social status, and family ties. For many descendants today, the distinction between a Haliwa-Saponi ancestor and an African American ancestor from the 18th or early 19th century is a retroactive one applied to different branches of a common family tree. The decision to later identify as Indian or Black was a social and political choice made by descendants of this shared ancestral pool, a choice heavily influenced by the oppressive racial landscape of the Jim Crow South. Part 2. The Color Line. Navigating a Biracial South. The fluid, multi-ethnic society that formed in the meadows during the colonial era faced an existential threat with the rise of the Jim Crow South in the post-Reconstruction period. The imposition of a rigid, legally enforced black/white racial binary created a social and political landscape with no room for ambiguity. This system sought to erase any third race by collapsing all non-white identities into the singular, disadvantaged category of colored. For the mixed ancestry people of Halifax and Warren counties, this presented a stark choice: accept the colored designation and the associated legal and social subjugation, or fight to establish a separate and distinct identity. Their response, a conscious and strategic movement to organize as an Indian tribe, was a direct act of resistance against this binary system, a political struggle for self-determination that would redefine their relationship with their African American kin and neighbors. 2.1. The imposition of a binary system. Erasing the third race, the legal and bureaucratic erasure of a distinct indigenous identity in eastern North Carolina was a gradual but relentless process. A pivotal moment came in 1835 when North Carolina amended its constitution. The new law stripped the right to vote from all free Negroes, free mulattoes, or free persons of mixed blood, a sweeping categorization that explicitly grouped the state's free Black and Indian populations together under a single legal disability. This act effectively eliminated the political personhood of non-white individuals who were not enslaved, marking the formal beginning of a state-sanctioned binary system. Many Haliwa-Saponi ancestors reacted to this disenfranchisement by migrating to areas with more favorable laws, such as Ohio, while others remained in the meadows, attempting to maintain their community quietly. This legal framework was reinforced by the evolving categories of the U.S. Census, which served as the primary tool for official racial classification. Throughout the 19th century, census enumerators, relying on their own observations, used a shifting and inconsistent set of labels. The same families in the meadows might be listed as white, mulatto, or free people of color in different census years, reflecting both the ambiguity of their appearance and the lack of a stable category for a tri-racial people. By the early 20th century, terms like mulatto were dropped in favor of a monolithic Black, Negro, or Negro descent, or simply colored category, which was applied to anyone with any known African ancestry under the one-drop rule. This bureaucratic practice effectively rendered the Indian ancestry of the Meadows people invisible in official records. The pressure to conform to this binary was intensified by the influence of neighboring Virginia's aggressive eugenics-based policies. Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924 was the culmination of a campaign led by Walter Plecker, the state's Registrar of Vital Statistics, to eliminate any legal recognition of Virginia's Indian tribes. The act established only two racial categories, white and colored, and defined white as having no trace whatsoever of any blood other than Caucasian, with a minor exception for those with 1/16 or less Native American ancestry, with the minor exception for those with 1/10 white or less Native American ancestry. The act established only two racial categories, white and colored, defining it as toxic, redly, and Pocahontas. Plecker used his authority to systematically reclassify nearly all Virginia Indians as colored, arguing that most were of mixed ancestry and were attempting to pass as Indian to escape the colored designation. This campaign of paper genocide had a profound impact on tribes across Virginia and created a chilling legal precedent that reinforced the binary system across the border in North Carolina, where the Meadows community resided. By the mid-20th century, the legal and social reality for the people of the Meadows was clear. To be non-white was to be classified, educated, and legally treated as black. The following table illustrates the systematic century-long process through which legal and bureaucratic tools were used to collapse nuanced multi-ethnic identities into a single legally disadvantaged colored category, providing the essential context for the Haliwa-Saponi identity movement that followed. 2.2 Racial Choices. The emergence of a modern Indian identity. Faced with this relentless pressure of legal and social erasure, the multi-ethnic community of the Meadows began a formal process of re-tribalization in the mid-20th century. This movement was a direct and strategic response to the Jim Crow binary, an effort to carve out a distinct political and social space as American Indians. This process, as documented by Haliwa-Saponi historian Marvin M. Richardson in his dissertation Racial Choices, was defined by a series of conscious decisions to assert an Indian identity and reject the colored designation that the state sought to impose upon them. The organizational effort began in the late 1940s and coalesced in 1953 with the formation of the Haliwa Indian Club, originally the Haliwa-Nash Croatan Indian Club. This was the foundational political act of the modern tribe. The name Haliwa was a portmanteau of Halifax and Warren counties, grounding their identity in their ancestral homeland. Led by figures like W.R. Talking Eagle Richardson, who returned from Philadelphia in 1955 to become the tribe's first chief, the community embarked on a campaign to solidify their separate status. This campaign centered on creating separate, Indian-only institutions as tangible proof of their distinctiveness. This was a critical strategy in a segregated society. The two most important achievements were the Haliwa Indian School, 1957 to 1957, for white and colored students. The Haliwa-Saponi refused to send their children to the colored schools. Instead, they established their own school. From 1957 to 1969, the Haliwa Indian School was the only non-reservation tribally supported school in North Carolina. Tribal members paid for the building, supplies, and teachers' salaries out of their own pockets, a profound act of self-determination and sacrifice. End quote. Similarly, the community established its own church, originally the Saponi Indian Baptist Church, creating a spiritual and social center separate from the black and white churches of the area. These institutions were not merely cultural centers, they were powerful political statements. They demonstrated to the state that the Haliwa were a cohesive, organized people, distinct from their African American neighbors. This effort culminated in 1965 when two pivotal events occurred. First, nearly 400 tribal members successfully sued in Halifax County Court to have the racial designation on their birth certificates, marriage licenses, and driver's licenses changed from colored to Indian. Second, on April 15, 1965, the state of North Carolina formally recognized the Haliwa Indians as a tribe. In 1979, the tribe added Saponi to its name to more accurately reflect its primary historical ancestry. A crucial and sensitive aspect of this political strategy was the community's public posture regarding its own multi-ethnic ancestry. As Marvin Richardson documents, Meadows Indians strategically denied African American ancestry while acknowledging white ancestry. This was not necessarily a denial of kinship or family history in private, but a pragmatic political calculation required to succeed in a deeply racist system. The one-drop rule was so powerful that any acknowledgement of African ancestry would have immediately disqualified their claim to a separate Indian status in the eyes of the state and federal government. To be recognized as Indian, they had to perform a version of identity that fit within the racial logic of the dominant society, a logic that saw Indian and Black as mutually exclusive categories. This entire process can be understood as a unique form of civil rights activism, one that ran parallel to but was fundamentally different from the mainstream Black civil rights movement, while the latter, exemplified by the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, sought to dismantle segregation and achieve integration and equality within the American polity. The Haliwa-Saponi's goal was different. They were not fighting for integration into white schools. They were fighting for the right to their own school. Their struggle was not primarily for civil rights as American citizens, but for political recognition and sovereignty as a distinct people. They sought to exit the Black/white binary altogether, not to achieve equality within it. This distinction is vital for understanding that their actions, which necessitated a political distancing from their Black relatives, were driven by a pro-sovereignty agenda rather than an anti-Black sentiment. 2.3 Community Perspectives and Social Fractures. The strategic racial choices made by the leaders of the Haliwa-Saponi movement were not universally embraced and came at a significant social cost. The process of formalizing a distinct Indian identity created new boundaries and tensions, both within the Meadows community and with their neighbors. Richardson's research reveals that the movement to organize as a tribe was not monolithic. It faced internal political disagreement and created divisions among the people. One faction of the Meadows community, as Richardson notes, embraced a racial identity as colored and worked within the existing Black-white political and institutional system. These individuals may have seen greater advantage in aligning with the broader Black community's struggle for civil rights, or they may have simply identified more strongly with their African American heritage. This divergence meant that the choice to be Indian was not available to or desired by everyone in the kinship network. The result was a political sorting process that began to fracture a once unified community, drawing a new, hard line between Indian and Black that cut through family trees and redefined relationships. This assertion of a separate identity also provoked a backlash from some in the surrounding communities. Richardson recounts that both Black and white locals often accused the members of the Haliwa Indian Club of being fake Indians who were acting uppity, as if they believed they were better than other colored folk. This sentiment reflects the powerful hold of the racial binary. In the minds of many, there was no legitimate third category, so the Haliwa-Saponi's claims were seen as a form of social climbing or a rejection of their true, that is to say, identity. This could lead to intense social pressure and even threats of violence against the movement's leaders. Children attending the colored schools who identified as Indian reported being told by their black classmates of their parents' plots against the Indian organizers. The social fractures created by this process were a direct and painful consequence of the oppressive external pressure of the Jim Crow system. The state's refusal to recognize a multi-ethnic identity forced the people of the Meadows into an impossible position. To survive as a distinct people, they had to formalize an identity that, by necessity, excluded some of their own kin and created friction with their neighbors. The legacy of this period is not just the successful emergence of the Haliwa-Saponi tribe, but also the memory of the internal and external conflicts that this emergence precipitated. The boundary between Indian and Black in Halifax and Warren counties, once porous and defined by fluid kinship, was hardened into a political and social reality. Part 3. Contemporary Identity, Recognition, and Relationship. The history of shared origins and strategic divergence continues to shape the Haliwa-Saponi people and their relationship with the African American community today. The legacy of the choices made in the 20th century is evident in the tribe's ongoing quest for federal recognition, in the modern discourse surrounding their ancestry, and in the complex interplay of identity, kinship, and politics. The historical forces of endogamy and paper genocide have created a unique set of contemporary challenges and realities that require a nuanced understanding of how a people's identity is defined and defended in the real code. 21st century. 3.1 The legacy of endogamy and paper genocide. A top priority for the Haliwa-Saponi Indian tribe is to achieve federal recognition from the United States government, a status that would formalize a government-to-government relationship and make the tribe and its 300 members eligible for federal services in healthcare, education, and housing. Despite being recognized by the state of North Carolina since 1965, the path to federal recognition is fraught with challenges directly linked to their unique history. The federal recognition process, historically managed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs Branch of Acknowledgement and Research, BAR, requires tribes to meet 7 stringent criteria, including providing extensive documentation of continuous existence as a distinct political and social entity from historical times to the present. This presents a profound paradox for the Haliwa-Saponi. The very paper genocide perpetrated by state and federal bureaucracies in the 19th and 20th centuries, which systematically erased their ancestors' Indian identity on official documents by classifying them as colored or mulatto, now creates a significant documentary gap. The historical records that the federal government demands as proof of continuity are often the very records that were systematically altered to deny that continuity. Furthermore, the tribe's history of intermixture and their origins as a triracial community, while a testament to their ancestors' resilience, can be used by opponents to challenge their claims. The extensive genealogical work of researchers like Paul Hynek, which meticulously traces the lineages of many core Haliwa-Saponi families back to free people of color in colonial Virginia and North Carolina, is sometimes cited as evidence against their claim of being a continuously existing Indian tribe. At the same time, the community's long history of endogamy, the practice of marrying within the group to maintain its cohesiveness, has left a biological legacy. While this practice preserved a distinct peoplehood, it has also resulted in a higher than average incidence of certain hereditary diseases, a genetic signature characteristic of a small, isolated population. The Haliwa-Saponi thus face a difficult political reality. The strategies of adaptation, intermixture, and community preservation that allowed their ancestors to survive the pressures of colonialism and Jim Crow are the very historical facts that are now used as arguments against their political legitimacy. The federal recognition process, with its rigid demand for an unbroken and pure documentary trail, is ill-equipped to account for the complex, messy, and resilient history of a people who survived by blending in, not by standing apart in a way that was easily legible to colonial record keepers. Their historical survival strategy is now framed as a lack of authenticity by the very government whose past policies made that strategy necessary. 3.2 Genealogy, Genetics, and the Modern Discourse on Ancestry. The contemporary relationship between the Haliwa-Saponi and their black neighbors, as well as the public perception of their identity, is heavily influenced by the modern and often contentious discourse on ancestry fueled by the rise of commercial DNA testing and online genealogy. This has created a new arena for the old debate over their identity. This has been a Sherry Plaza presentation.